The coast. It is Tuesday, January the 25th. I am your host, Jon Cohen, covering the news in our nation this week from sea to shining sea. I want you to imagine for a moment that you work for the Biden administration. Now, I know this will be a painful thought for many of you, but just indulge me here. You work for the current administration, and it is Wednesday, November 6th, 2024. As a surprise to no one, your geriatric boss has just been handed a decisive defeat at the hands of the Republican candidate. Even though Hillary wanted to run, Joe Biden pumped enough Prevagen into his veins to remember his name long enough to seek re-election. But his approval ratings of 7% weren't enough to overcome the fierce competition that came from conservatives. Now, you find yourself out of work and searching for a job. Unlike Jen Psaki and Antony Blinken, who already have cushy multi-million-dollar deals over at CNN and MSNBC, you actually have to go out on job interviews, engaging in the arduous ordeal of sending out the resume and hoping for a phone call. And then one day, your phone rings. A large corporate firm has received your resume, and they want you to come on in for an interview. You shine your shoes, throw on your best suit, and head over to I Street. You anxiously wait in the lobby, sipping your Starbucks crappa latte as staffers scurry past you. And finally, your name is called. You sit down in your would-be boss's plush corner office. As beads of sweat form upon the crest of your brow, he looks up from your resume. I see you went to Harvard Law. And you think to yourself, so what? Every other schleprock who works here also attended an Ivy League law school. I see you intern for Congressman blah, blah, blah. No big deal, you say to yourself. Every other attorney was, at some point, sycophantic errand boy or girl to some Democrat on the Hill. Ah, but then something catches his eye. I see you worked at the White House for President Cream of Wheat. Elation forms upon your face, and grinning ear to ear, you say, indeed I did. He shakes your hand, offers you $300K a year plus a Mercedes, and the next chapter of your life has begun. You're just about to walk out the door of his office when he says to you, by the way, you won't be working in our corporate litigation department. Probate work then, you inquire? No, I've got something special in mind for you. After cleaning up that doddering geriatric fool's mess for 4 years, you're going to be the firm's new fixer. Now, for those of you who have seen Michael Clayton starring George Clooney or Ray Donovan with Liev Schreiber, you know precisely what a fixer is. But for the uninitiated, a fixer in common parlance is a person who fixes other people's problems, most especially those who are wealthy or high profile. You mop up their mess and, generally speaking, get paid pretty comfortably to do so. I know this because I was once a quasi-fixer at a law firm in Miami. All too many times I would deal with the drunken sibling or unscrupulous child of a wealthy client, dealing with their shenanigans as to not bring shame to the client's pristine reputation. Joe Biden's first year in office was an unmitigated disaster. Like a ship tossed to and fro on the high seas of a maelstrom, the American people were swept up in a whirlwind of illegal immigration, failed fiscal policy followed by inflation, failed international policy, and an onslaught of derogatory, divisive, racist accusations from a president who has approval ratings somewhere around the IQ of a beagle. And while the Biden presidency attempted to hit the reset button this past week with a speech so painful that it would make Jimmy Carter look like the ancient Greek orator Demosthenes, White House staff, namely Jen Psaki, have been working overtime as fixers to mop up the enormous mess left behind by our inept president. So, as you may recall last week, Joe Biden had this to say about a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine.
What you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc.
Meanwhile, you have Vladimir Putin in classic Bond villain fashion, just laughing hysterically at these comments from Joe Biden. Foolish American president. And everyone from our European allies to the guy who waxes the floor at the White House is asking themselves, what is this idiot doing? So, of course, Jen Psaki, who is just counting the days until that sweet gig over at CNN, had to do a presser and try and bail out our floundering, inane president.
I assure you that our allies and partners know exactly what the president's position is. They knew what it was yesterday. They knew during the press conference. They knew after the press conference, because we have been engaged closely and working in lockstep with them for weeks.
Now, I will be the first to admit that I'm no international relations guru. I don't have a degree from Georgetown in international affairs. But I'm pretty sure that if I'm the president of Ukraine and the president of the United States rolls out the red carpet in a speech for a Russian invasion of my country in full Neville Chamberlain fashion, I'm going to be a little bit nervous. But God bless Jen Psaki for having to clean up behind her geriatric boss. Meanwhile, you have the second dumbest person, only to AOC, in all of politics. I, of course, am talking about Batman villain the Joker, a.k.a. Kamala Harris, being asked about Joe Biden's illegitimate election comments during his speech. And she just adds a layer to the crap sandwich, which the White House has been serving up with these brilliant comments.
I think now that these bills haven't been passed, that the 22 midterms won't be legitimate or fair or free.
Let's not conflate issues. So what we are looking at, and the topic of so much debate last night, was that we as America cannot afford to allow this blatant erosion of our democracy, and in particular, the right of all Americans who are eligible to vote to have access to the ballot.
Interesting that she didn't respond to the question with the concise answer that, of course, future elections will be legitimate. She just adds fuel to the fire with these nonsensical comments that unless Democrats get their way, all future elections are illegitimate. And I'm here to tell every Democrat in Washington, this crap ain't gonna work. This is a failed strategy and a dangerous one at that. As I said the other day, if you want to sow the seeds for a civil war, an actual insurrection, since insurrection is the new word of the year for Democrats, then double down on this stuff. Seriously, guys, double down on it. You have sitting congressmen like James Clyburn, who grew up in the Jim Crow South, who remembers actual voter suppression and poll taxes, and people being beaten in the streets, spewing his propaganda as well.
We know the history of Alabama. We know the history of Georgia, Florida, Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina. We know that history. And so they're now making these changes. And one change is if you give somebody a drink of water standing in line,
come on,
it's a felony. That is crazy.
Now, you know what's really crazy is the fact that Jim Clyburn has some sort of obsessive compulsive disorder with the water thing. He has literally been obsessed with this for weeks. The water, the water. The water is voter suppression. Ah! I mean, come on, guys. I mean, how can we have according to James Clyburn, how can we have a legitimate election if campaigns can't hand out 25-cent bottles of Walmart water to voters? Free Walmart bottled water is clearly the key to fair and legitimate elections. I mean, I think this is somewhere in the Constitution, isn't it? They've got nothing. They're shooting blanks. They know they're shooting blanks. And making elections the bugaboo is the key. At least they think it's the key. Initially, we thought that maybe prolonging COVID would be the means by which Democrats would justify much of the altered election procedures of 2020 making their way into 2022. But COVID is waning, which we'll talk about later. So now Plan B is mythical voter suppression. And if we can't get it passed, then the elections are just not legitimate. Oh, and by the way, if you don't agree with our federalization of elections, you're all Jim Crow racists version 2.0. Please keep running with this stuff, Democrats. Please. Keep running the football with negative 10 yards of offense. Keep doing it. And so egregious is all this rhetoric. Jen Psaki, after doing some lines of cocaine in the White House bathroom to get her through the day, has to come out and run interference for these idiots once again.
Not intending to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. He was actually attempting to make the opposite point, which is that in 2020, despite COVID, despite many attempts to suppress the vote, a record number of voters, Democrats and Republicans, independents too, turned out in the face of a pandemic, and election officials made sure they could vote and have those votes counted.
Okay, so question, how was there voter suppression in 2020? You just said record numbers of people came out and voted, and yet there were attempts to suppress the vote. Show me one shred of evidence that in 2020 there was a concerted effort to suppress the vote. You won't find one. And it's funny that she says he wasn't talking about the illegitimacy of elections. Pretty sure that he was. I know it's hard to understand him in his geriatric mumbo jumbo that he speaks, but pretty clear that's what he said in his speech last week.
That they would in any way be illegitimate?
Oh, yeah, I think it easily could be illegitimate.
Yeah, but major kudos to Jen Psaki for being there with the napkin and wiping the president's mouth as drool and cream of wheat come oozing out. Meanwhile, you have Antony Blinken, our fatuous Secretary of State, also earning his fixer stripes on Meet the Press as he attempts to mop up the giant dump that Joe Biden took on our European allies.
I want to play what the president said at the press conference and ask you a question about it on the other side. This created a little bit of a stir. Here's what he said.
I think what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc.
What did the president say that wasn't true?
Chuck, we have been clear that, first, in the event that there is a renewed Russian incursion, Russian forces going into Ukraine, there is going to be a swift, a severe, and united response. But we've also been clear that there are other things, we were just talking about this, that Russia could do, short of sending forces into Ukraine again, to try to destabilize or topple the government, cyber attacks, hybrid means, etc. And there, we've also been clear, there'll be a swift response, there'll be a calibrated response, there'll be a united response.
A swift and united response. Well, apparently Joe Biden didn't get that memo. Yeah, he forgot to mention that. For better or worse, the President of the United States is the mouthpiece for the Republic. I know this is troubling, considering that our current mouthpiece sounds like a drunken hobo playing a harmonica, but it is the reality of our nation's tradition. The President speaks for the nation when it comes to foreign policy. He is the commander-in-chief. And I don't care what conversations Antony Blinken is having behind closed doors with Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, when the President of the United States is openly stating that a minor incursion will not be met with a response from the U.S., then that's a problem. And speaking of foreign policy, one would think that this administration had learned their lesson about failed embassy evacuations with the debacle that was Afghanistan. Undoubtedly the worst foreign policy disaster in this nation's history, but apparently not, because when asked by Chuck Todd if there will be an evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev after non-essential personnel have requested to be extracted, Antony Blinken's like, yeah, we're tracking this intensely. Yeah.
To choose.
There's been some reports that our embassy in Ukraine has made a request to send non-essential personnel home now, begin that process. Have you approved that request yet? And if not, what are you waiting for?
Chuck, this is something that we look at every single day. I have no higher responsibility than the safety and well-being of the folks who work for the State Department and who are under my care, in a sense. So we're tracking this very, very closely. We're looking at it on really a daily basis. And if we need to make a determination that we should draw down some of the folks at the embassy, we'll do that based on the security needs.
But right now, you feel like Kiev appears safe, at least in the near term.
This is something, again, we're tracking intensely.
Okay.
I'm sure everyone at the embassy in Kiev is just sleeping so soundly knowing that Antony Blinken is looking out for them as he did for the embassy in Afghanistan. Well, it didn't take him long to get a fire under his tuchus, because later on Sunday, after giving this interview on Meet the Press, things drastically changed. This from the New York Times. The State Department said on Sunday that it had ordered family members of U.S. Embassy personnel in Kiev, Ukraine, to leave the country amid increasing concerns about a possible Russian invasion. The embassy will remain open for now, senior State Department officials said in a briefing with reporters, but some diplomats have been authorized to depart as well. Well, we all know what happens when you wait until the 11th hour to get our diplomats out of embassies. And you know how we know? Because it literally just occurred last summer. This is going to be Afghanistan, the sequel. But fear not, for the president has announced he's putting 8,500 troops on alert for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. Okay, I have a question. Why aren't they already there? You do not deter aggressive actions in Ukraine by having troops on alert for deployment. You deter it from having troops on the ground at the border. I'm sure Vladimir Putin is just quaking in his boots that 8,500 troops who will have to be deployed might be coming their way while his troops could literally throw a bottle of vodka over to Ukrainian territory. Joe Biden has precipitated a potential war because he's just weak. He's a weak president, weak commander-in-chief, weak person, and he invites war with this insurmountable level of weakness. And speaking of war, one of Joe Biden's greatest domestic issues right now is the fact that his own party is at war with itself because of his incompetent leadership. Forget about trying to convince Republicans to jump on board with him. He can't even get his own party to stop fighting amongst itself long enough to govern. Even Chuck Todd is continuing his crusade against Biden on Meet the Press. I thought last week might be a fluke, but 2 weeks in a row we're getting some honest criticism of the White House. And on this week's show, Chuck Todd uses my favorite word in his Biden criticisms, shellacked.
3 poll numbers you need to know best. I'm going to start with perhaps the most important number to understand the direction of the midterms. It's job approval here. The president's job approval rating sitting at 43%. If you look at history shows that kind of presidential approval rating leads to a shellacking for the party in power.
A shellacking. Stick a fork in them, they're done. And for no other reason than Joe Biden's trusted advisor and Politburo chief, Bernie Stalin Sanders, going on Meet the Press and talking about how he wants fellow party members like Kyrsten Sinema to be publicly castigated. I swear, this guy should have been born in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and worked for the KGB.
So it's been healthy for the Democratic Party to highlight the division in the party. You know, you look at Senator Sinema, she was censured by the Arizona Democratic Party over what some will look at as a disagreement over tactics, not over substance, but over tactics. Do you think that was an appropriate action?
Yeah, I do. I think it's exactly right. Look, on that issue of voting rights, this is something that's almost different than anything else. What that is that right now you have a Republican Party under Trump's leadership that is perpetuating this big lie that Trump actually won the election. And therefore you have 19 Republican states that are moving very aggressively into voter suppression, into extreme gerrymandering. Some of these states are doing away with the powers of independent election officials.
Please let Bernie Sanders keep talking. Please. Not only does he want to have Maoist struggle sessions for members of his own party, but he is the Politburo propaganda minister, pointing the finger at those evil Republicans who want to suppress elections. Democrats, let this old commie be your mouthpiece. Please. Please. As a conservative, the one thing I do love is when Bernie Sanders speaks, he is so divisive that it just makes conservatives want to be more conservative. He's like a male communistic version of Hillary Clinton. His mouth opens and people just run to the other side. Every single one of these states that he's chastising right now are going redder with every nonsensical, gibberish-filled statement he issues. And so great is his animus for Sinema and Manchin that he's even adding to the divisiveness by saying that he won't even work with the president if the president conciliates with Manchin.
Perhaps the leading progressive voice in the Democratic coalition. Can President Biden count on your vote in the Senate with almost any compromise he comes up with Manchin?
No, you got to look at, no, absolutely not. You're going to have to look at.
Wow. Yeah, Bernie's a real team player. Conversely, you have Alyssa Slotkin, moderate Democrat from Michigan, saying, no, throwing people under the bus, having public Maoist struggle sessions, tarring and feathering them, not good for party morale.
What's happening to Senator Sinema, is this healthy for the party, having a state party, her own state party, censure her? Like I said, most people will look at what they're censuring her over a disagreement on tactics, not on the issue.
Yeah, I just don't come from a school where you're constantly airing dirty laundry. Like, there are really big divisions in Washington right now, period. Democrat, Republican, within each party. But I just don't believe that the way that you get back at other people is by putting that on air, airing that publicly. So I don't love that. I also don't think that, if we disagree with someone, that's a normal part of governing.
Yeah, the Democrats are really just the Hatfields and the McCoys right now, just loving one another. I mean, and can't you see the unity in the party? Unity. Yeah, speaking of party morale, Nancy Pelosi, who was born sometime around the discovery of America, was trying desperately to drum up some party morale last week when she announced that the House Democratic Caucus was the greatest collection, I couldn't make this up if I tried, greatest collection of intellect, integrity, and imagination for doing the right thing for the American people. And we even have a sound clip of it.
To my members on a regular basis when we gather in caucus, and as you know, sometimes it's hybrid these days, but anytime we have gathered in caucus, one way or actually virtually or hybrid, I've said to them, under this roof, figuratively or actually, is the greatest collection of intellect, integrity, and imagination for doing the right thing for the American people.
Okay. So there's a fundamental flaw in this statement by Nancy Pelosi. By collection, you are insinuating that the inestimable Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is included in this group of intellect, integrity, and imagination. Now, I'll give you the imagination part for her. Her imagination is pretty vivid in that she conjures up all kinds of crazy crap about getting rid of the Senate and how Florida is bad despite going there on vacation. But integrity and especially intellect? Yeah, no. AOC's intellect in tangible measurement is like a BB ball rolling around in a boxcar. There's a lot of empty space. Nice try, though, Nancy. I applaud you for trying to rally the troops during this depressing time just before you get your asses whipped in November and that gavel gets passed back to Kevin McCarthy. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. All Republicans, listen to me. Republicans, all you have to do is grab a beer, a bowl of pistachio nuts, and watch the Democratic Party Hunger Games. These guys are so fractured and splintered at this point that 2022, even according to Chuck Todd, is a shoo-in for Republicans. He who speaks first loses. Republicans, shut your mouths, keep quiet, let these morons have at one another. And once 22 comes and goes, then Joe Biden will be even more impotent than he is now. All right, we'll get to more news in just a moment. But first, I've got that all-important question that you ask yourself every day. Are you tired of establishment media only providing you one side of the story? Ready for a fresh new perspective with hard-hitting facts and truth, spliced with humor and sarcastic wit through a conservative lens? Then you've come to the right place. Coast to Coast, the Conservative Podcast, is available on all major podcast apps, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. You can now also check us out online at coasttocoast.buzzsprout.com. That's COAST, the number 2, COAST.buzzsprout.com. Please subscribe today. A few weeks ago, I watched a Swedish-made film entitled Aniara, which is based on the famous poem by Swedish poet Harry Martinson. In the movie, as in the poem, a ship traveling from Earth to Mars is knocked off course, and the passengers are relegated to wandering aimlessly through space until they all die. It's a pretty nihilistic film, but revelational in its depiction of how humanity handles crisis. At one point, well into their space exile, the passengers start to develop cults in order to cope with their ultimate demise. It would seem that the formation of cults in the presence of fear is a fairly normative response, and this is certainly true of our fear-loving cult of COVID. So last week, Bari Weiss, the former New York Times journalist, went on Real Time with Bill Maher and had this to say about COVID.
So hard on COVID. I sprayed the Pringles cans that I bought at the grocery store, stripped my clothes off because I thought COVID would be on my clothes. Like, I did it all. I watched Tiger King. I got to the end of Spotify. Like, we all did it, right? Well, here's the thing. A lot of us did do it. And then we were told, you get the vaccine. You get the vaccine and you get back to normal. And we haven't gotten back to normal. And it's ridiculous at this point. I know that so many of my liberal and progressive friends are with me on this, and they do not want to say it out loud because they are scared to be called anti-vax or to be called science denial or to be, smeared as a Trumper. I'm sorry, if you believe the science, you will look at the data that we did not have.
Well, you can imagine it took the cultish left all of about 2.5 seconds to morally ridicule Bari Weiss and tell the world that she's a no good, very bad unperson for blaspheming against the philosophy of the COVID cult. You're not allowed to say, guys, you're not allowed to say that you're tired of COVID. You're supposed to live in fear of COVID from now until the year 2178. And if you're tired of COVID, You're cast out into the place of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. This from Fox News. The liberal media is losing their cool over former New York Times opinion editor Bari Weiss's admission that she's had enough with COVID-19. Weiss joined HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday to express her exhaustion with the pandemic, stressing how it's, quote, ridiculous. It is. The nation has not returned to normal after 2 years, a sentiment she said is bipartisan. Quote, I know that so many of my liberal and progressive friends are with me on this, and they do not want to say it out loud because they are scared to be called anti-vax or to be smeared as a Trumper, she spilled. Quote, at this point, it's a pandemic of bureaucracy. It's not real anymore. Media pundits, including CNN anchor Jim Acosta, oh yes, Jim Acosta, who loves himself more than Jeffrey Toobin, dragged Weiss for her remarks. During a segment with CNN medical analyst Dr. Jonathan Reiner on Sunday, Acosta considered Weiss a troll for even daring to disagree. Quote, I'm done with that attitude, Acosta said. She needs to understand that trolling people to own the libs is not a sacrifice. I mean, unbelievable. Dr. Jonathan Reiner, medical analyst for CNN, tweeted out this, quote, I'm sorry Bari Weiss is really inconvenienced by the pandemic, and I'm glad that she's done with it. But 3,600 Americans died yesterday, and over 860,000 have died in the last 2 years. Yes, you were told that vaccines would bring us out of this, but 25% of this country refused to vax. Grow up. Yes, nothing like the cult of COVID telling someone to grow up. You know what's really fascinating by this tweet is the fact that Dr. Reiner says, you were told that vaccines would bring us out of this, but 25% of this country refuses to vax. Okay, and what does that have to do with Bari Weiss saying she's tired of it? Seriously, what? I haven't met a single person that is not sick and tired of COVID, liberal or conservative. I do not understand why this is a radical statement, but you see, this isn't about the rationality of stating you're tired of living your life in fear and isolation. This is about initiated members of the cult, people like Jonathan Reiner, MD, telling you that if you even utter such sacrilegious words, it's because you're like those other 25%, those evil people who won't get vaccinated. By the way, the WHO even announced this week that the pandemic is effectively over with Omicron. But because Jonathan Reiner said you've got to continue to be scared, then run around screaming like people in Independence Day who are about to be vaporized by an alien space laser. The article continues. Dr. Reiner chimed in and encouraged Weiss to grow up and stop acting like a child, likening the situation to a kid who doesn't want to play this game anymore. Quote, all that we've done is ask the people to wear a mask when you go out and about and get vaccinated, he said. Quote, so I'm glad she's done with it. Well, we're all done with it. And doesn't mean that we don't care that people are still dying. It just means at some point between now and the 24th century, we have to get on with our lives. Jonathan Reiner, MD. Guess what? Everyone who's been vaccinated should be done with it because people are not dying from Omicron if they've been vaccinated. That is the science. Period. The article continues. MSNBC host Mehdi Hasan ripped Weiss for moaning about the pandemic as part of his high-speed 60-second rant segment on Sunday, which I'm sure we all tuned into. Quote, oh, it's ridiculous, is it? ? He responded. People who should be complaining right now are our overworked and burned out healthcare workers. But no, it's never them moaning or whining about the pandemic. Quote, my young children have handled this pandemic more maturely and less childishly than the likes of Bari Weiss, who, I'm sorry, can't go to as many indoor parties as she'd like to. Oh, really? You want to go there? You want to talk about some indoor parties? Well, that list is long and distinguished of your fellow Democratic friends who decided that rules didn't apply to them. People like Gavin Newsom and London Breed and Barack Obama, who all partied it up indoors and unmasked. And I could go on and on, so you don't want to go there. MSNBC contributor and Washington Post opinion writer Jennifer Rubin weighed in on Twitter with her own reaction, faulting Weiss for losing, quote unquote, her moral compass. Oh, yes, her moral compass. Quote, and she wants to teach your child, Rubin tweeted. Notice the rhetoric used by Jennifer Rubin. Moral compass. See, this is about morality, folks. If you're for wearing masks until the ability to travel faster than light is developed, you're willing to take booster shots until COVID booster vaccines ooze out of your tear ducts. And you keep kids out of school so that they can read on a third grade level when they're 27 years old. If you do all those things, then you're a moral, upright person. Otherwise, you're a sinister, heinous, evil unperson who seeks to corrupt our society and especially our children. Ah, yes, the children, the wee little children. The left cares so much about the little ones, so much that they want to keep them out of school so that we have an entire generation of uneducated idiots. But Weiss isn't the only media figure expressing her honesty. Wait, things are about to suddenly change. She's not the only one expressing her honesty about COVID exhaustion. CBS host Gayle King told The Late Show with Stephen Colbert earlier this month that she's so tired of being afraid of the virus and facing the threat of being locked down. Quote, I think we all have got to figure out how we can live our lives and navigate it, she said. Quote, I would much rather run down Times Square buck naked than go home. Well, I'm not sure if we want to see Gayle King do that. But Gayle King can say this, and if she does, she's just venting frustration. But Bari Weiss says it, and it's unmitigated evil. It's lack of morality. But remember, guys, COVID isn't politicized. It's never been a political virus. There are no politics in COVID. Yeah. The COVID saga continues. Speaking of sagas, the saga of wokeness and the politicization of nearly every aspect of society is something that most of us just hate, especially when it comes to areas such as sports. For a very long time, sports were a sort of safe haven from the pollution of politics and virtue signaling that we saw in so many other aspects and sectors of our society, such as commerce, religion, media. But now, we all lament that even sport has become center stage in the battleground of wokeness. So some of you might recall that we reported on a story several weeks ago about the controversy surrounding a transgender swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania who was breaking all kinds of records. A biological male, up until 2 years ago, decided that he wanted to be a female, and as such then wanted to compete as a female swimmer. And as you can imagine, he began devastating his female competition because, and I know this is controversial, men and women have different anatomies and as such compete at different competitive levels in sports. And I even raised the question, what happens when this swimmer breaks Katie Ledecky's records? Seriously. Does that no longer make Katie Ledecky the greatest female swimmer of all time? And what does that do to someone? What does that do to the psyche of someone who's trained their entire life just to have their record shattered because a biological male is allowed to compete with women? Well, the NCAA announced that they are going to revise the policy. Now they are going to leave the decision up to the international governing body for each sport rather than automatically let transgender athletes compete in the gender in which they identify. And as you can imagine, now even the NCAA, the wokest of all organizations, is now no good, very bad, and transphobic. This from Sports Illustrated. An associate director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Division III Kenyon College withdrew from an NCAA-run LGBTQ+ #diversity and inclusion program Monday in protest over the governing body's new transgender eligibility policy announced Wednesday. Dorian Raya Debussy, a volunteer facilitator, submitted a letter directly to NCAA President Mark Emmert, along with D3 interim Vice President Louise McClary and several DEI officials. As a facilitator for the NCAA program called LGBTQ1, Debussy had helped train athletes, coaches, administrators, and other facilitators from various colleges across the country in inclusion best practices since the program. The first of its kind for LGBTQ+ athletes in the NCAA, started in spring of 2019. Among the program's 54 facilitators, Debussy was the only one who is openly trans feminine. Quote, I'm deeply troubled by what appears to be a devolving level of active, effective, committed, and equitable support for gender diverse student athletes within the NCAA's leadership, end of quote, they wrote in the letter, published publicly by the advocacy organization Athlete Ally. Quote, as a non-binary trans feminine person, I can no longer in good conscience maintain my affiliation with the NCAA, end of quote. The NCAA did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Last week, the NCAA announced a major change to its trans eligibility policy, which had not been updated since 2010. Whereas before it allowed trans athletes to compete on teams aligned with their gender identity, so long as trans feminine athletes completed 1 year of testosterone suppression treatment, it now leaves decisions of which transgender athletes qualify for competition up to the individual sport governing bodies. The patchwork system is thought by some advocates to pass the buck instead of ensuring all trans athletes can safely compete alongside their cisgender peers regardless of testosterone levels. Okay, so I have a question. Regardless of how high or low your testosterone levels are, what about anatomical makeup? Seriously, what about musculoskeletal composition? What about strength? I'm sorry, but we can have this debate from now until the end of time. But the science is, and we always hear about the science is and has been for thousands of years that if you have two X chromosomes, you are one gender, which since the beginning of time has been called woman. And if you have an X and a Y chromosome, you're another gender that since the beginning of time has been called man. End of discussion. When we tell someone that you can work your entire life, you can get up at 4 a.m. and practice all day, do online school, give up your entire life to achieve a goal of being the GOAT, the greatest of all time, like Katie Ledecky or Simone Biles, only to have it taken away because someone decided they want to no longer be Joe, but Joanna, then you discredit everything these athletes are striving to achieve. And I'm, of course, talking about the cisgender athletes. Has anyone ever thought to ask the athletes how they feel about someone coming into their gender of their sport and supplanting everyone born biologically in that gender? Have they? Has anyone asked them? And don't get me wrong, there are always exceptions when a specific gender team doesn't exist in a particular sport. I remember in high school, we had a female on our wrestling team because there were no high school wrestling teams in my state. But when she got to the collegiate level where there were, you know which team she competed on? The women's team. Not because of discrimination, but honestly because she would have gotten her clock cleaned by the men at that level. And that's not being mean, that's the truth. Instead, she competed on the women's collegiate wrestling team at her school, and she was very successful. So why does the NCAA upholding a standard, which has existed in sport for centuries, for millennia, mean that it's devolving? If anything, the NCAA no longer adopting a blanket policy that any transgender athlete can compete in the sport in which they identify shows they actually care about fairness and a level playing field for the sake of the athletes. If you want to talk about morality, that's about as moral as it gets. And I want to end with this. As a society, when we can no longer have the courage to say that men have certain unique skills and talents and women have certain unique skills and talents, then we are truly devolving. Well, that's all we have for today. We'll see you back here on Friday. I am Jon Cohen, and this has been Coast to Coast, the Conservative Podcast. Thank you, everyone.